Prometheus.
Carry on.
Thank you for joining us for this interview of the book you have read.
Yes.
An Inconvenient Truth by Gore.
Indeed.
Do you think that this book aged well?
No.
It was published in 2006, I believe.
Correct.
And why hasn't it aged well?
Most of the more radical claims it has made about rising water levels to temperatures to forest fires have not been substantiated. They have neither increased, and in many cases they seem to have been decreasing.
Would you say that the book was scientifically accurate?
Only by the barest of margins.
Does it make sense for the one the mentor that Al Gore had, that put the
CO2 measuring equipment.
Okay. At the top of a volcano to measure CO2 levels?
The reasoning behind it was that it would be uncontaminated by industrial sources.
Okay.
Reasonable considering it is in the middle of the Pacific.
That makes sense.
But he seems to have completely ignored the completely natural, or at the very least it was not mentioned in this book, the completely natural source of CO2 from active volcanoes, of which the volcano they happen to be on, along with most in the general area, were producing CO2.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did some personal research on this, and supposedly they have taken these numbers out. But that also requires a bit of guesstimation on how much was coming out to begin with.
Right, unless they did a separate test.
Yes.
And how would you do? Anyway, okay. What were Gore's sticking points? Like, for instance, did he mention food crops? Did he mention mud? Did he mention polar bears and penguins, etc.?
Polar bears, ironically enough, received less attention than penguins.
Interesting.
In the book. Penguins, I believe, got 2 to 3 pages worth of pictures, while the polar bears got 1.5.
Okay.
He had many sticking points. Usually wet areas are getting wetter and dry areas are getting drier, and that all the bread baskets are going to dry up to deserts, all the water's going to disappear, but the ocean's going to rise about 20 feet.
How much of that do you think has to do with the fact that so many of these crops are grown in inappropriate areas? For instance, the Aral Sea and the cotton crop.
Yes, that is definitely a huge possibility. If you overtax your water supply for a certain area, you're going to start running out, even if you happen to live in Ohio, where the water comes from rocks. If you attempt to grow seaweed or algae or anything like that, you're going to start running out of it pretty quickly.
Right.
It's just too water intensive. So I'm definitely thinking that was a possibility. But there have also been issues of climate changes all throughout history. In fact, recent studies have started to suggest that the Sahara may have been a grass plain instead of a desert.
I think we can all agree the climate does change.
Absolutely.
The fear that Al Gore was presenting was that
it was a radical change that was pretty much impossible to properly control, contain, and would destabilize the basis of what we depend upon.
So he was creating a fear of the sky is falling.
Pretty much.
Okay. And that didn't age well, obviously.
No, because we still have crops that come in every year. They're still kept in grain bins. They go to market same as they always have.
It's interesting that he talks about some 30 so-called new diseases that have emerged over the last 25 to 30 years, and some old diseases that had been under control are now surging again. I believe these are on pages 174 and 175. I'll try and include a picture. Were you surprised to see a virus that shut down the world in 2020?
To some extent, yes. Yes, it was a bit shocking to see that.
Now, based on the threat that we've recently received, one of the diseases mentioned is about to have a resurgence,
Yes.
which would be smallpox.
Yes.
Do you think that these diseases are returning due to quote unquote climate change?
I would not say so much climate change. I would say political instabilities would have a greater deal with that. Mainly, these diseases still exist in other parts of the world. People carry them, may not even know about them until much later, and they unintentionally bring it to the Western world while trying to escape and find a better life.
So, what would you say is decreasing the population's immunity to fight these diseases?
Well, these diseases never had a great immunity to begin with. They had incredible mortality rates, especially when considering things like smallpox. But if I had to take a guess, it's probably due to the fact that smallpox hasn't been a great threat to this country since at least the 50s. I would put that number, and we had been immunizing the population since before that. So human bodies in America just wouldn't be quite used to it, especially if this strain is slightly different than the American strain that we have been immunizing against. An African strain of smallpox might have different genetics in it.
Okay.
On that note, I would just like to mention an interesting dichotomy of observance of these issues. One would say, well, those refugees are coming from political instability that are caused because the climate is changing. It's becoming warmer and hotter. Crops are being harder to predict in these areas. And that's how one would view this from, if you were to believe Al Gore's perspective. One also could say that it's the problem of the politics in the region. It doesn't have the required technology or general system of governance to require that technology to build up a safe house for and against any climate inconsistencies like America has, or most of the Western world. We have large amounts of grain, but even in America, if you're to take a grain harvester for, say, soybeans, a 30-second shower could clog up the machine, which is incredible. Just think about it, 30 seconds of shower and rain, you clog up an $80,000 machine. That's a bit annoying, so every little bit of thing is an annoyance, even with the machines, but you can still harvest 50 times as much in those 30 seconds before the shower with one of those grain harvesters than by hand.
True. Very true. Did Al Gore mention anything about the depopulation from diseases?
He did not mention anything about depopulation from diseases, just that they were coming back.
Kind of to go back to the animals that I had mentioned earlier, what can you tell us about the March of the Penguins?
March of the Penguins. I have personally not watched the documentary, I believe.
But what did the book say?
What did the book say? I honestly do not remember that
Apparently nothing of substance.
Nothing of substance, mainly the fact that the penguins still march, and there are some problems because the thinner ice sheets near the coast have a tendency to break off, and the penguins don't swim back to the mainland and starve on the ice sheets or something.
That doesn't make any sense.
Mainly because they sometimes lose their chicks on these ice sheets that just disappear.
Oh.
Yes.
Emotion. What does Gore say about rising sea levels?
Oh, he mentions that greatly in congruence with the melting West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland melting ice sheet, saying that should they disappear within 20, 30 years, we could experience sea level rises of up to 20 feet.
Interesting.
Not only have these ice sheets been officially recorded as continuing to disappear, but still there, sea level rise has remained consistent at about half a penny's thickness a year. So no major sea level rise, and in areas where they were measuring sea level rise greatly, it may have turned out that they built it on sand and the sand is now sinking. Miami, Florida is an example of this. because 1920s capitalistic ventures, due to less than ideal economics, they got played.
I did notice that on pages 186 and 187, there's a picture of a boy in the water. Presumably his mother and a sibling are in front of their
Yes.
shack of a home that is in
South Pacific Island regions, yes.
Yeah, it's the but it showed the picture is at high tide and the boy is having a grand old time. Does Al Gore include a picture of the same family at low tide?
No, he does not.
Do you think that's a little bit deceptive?
Potentially, yes. Also, I would like to add another level of potential deception. Calling some of these islands that people live on islands is a great misservice, as they are closer to shoals and sandy embankments in the Pacific Ocean than actual islands. And
It can't be compared to Hawaii
precisely
versus the pictures that he included.
Precisely. In some of these cases, the islands don't even reach the surface. They are quite literally at sea level.
Wow.
So any rise in tide is going to look fairly significant.
Right. And then if there's a storm, it's even worse.
Even worse, correct.
Okay. Oh, the name of it is the Funafuti.
I am not familiar with that island.
You are. When I show you a picture, you'll recognize it.
It looks like a circle with basically nothing around it.
With a huge lagoon in the middle.
Yes. Now, I would like to mention that there were some cases where a tribe on one of these islands, maybe Funafuti, but I do not remember the name of it, was recorded as suffering from global warming, and they asked for the Australian government to take their several thousand strong population to the mainland and set them up as refugees. The Australian government researched this a bit. They eventually did take them, but they noticed a very large grouping of people every night taking handfuls of sand from their island and throwing it into the ocean.
Why would they do that?
They figured they could get... It's the popular belief that they were sinking their island, hoping that the Australian government would give them homes on the mainland.
Oh, brother.
I do not know about this story, but it is a fascinating one nonetheless.
Yes. Okay, so based on the author's claim of the crisis of the rising sea levels, the urgency behind the words he chose,
Yes.
what are your thoughts of global warming mouthpieces buying waterfront properties?
An interesting dichotomy, to say the least. If New York would be flooded, that makes it interesting that somebody would choose to set up fairly close to Martha's Vineyard, especially considering that those waters are going to start being infected with mosquitoes very soon as well. So you're going to have a risk of your own family's life. So I do not know why they would put themselves in the thick of it, but one could say it was honorable. They're putting themselves right at the front line.
What are your thoughts about the speculative pictures of certain areas being underwater? So Manhattan as an example. He gives one example of how Manhattan is,
Yes.
and then speculates how Manhattan would look when the water rises. However, I noticed that he says the World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater, and yet there are still two islands that are showing. It seemed as though he made it, this is where the water would go, and the water wouldn't go here, and we know water goes where it wants to go.
Yes.
So how would he know that the World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater versus those islands that were also in the picture?
Depending on how high they were.
Okay.
They might have been higher than the 21 feet. And
True.
that might have explained it. I do not know the geography of New York very well.
Or Manhattan specifically.
Or Manhattan specifically. But I would say this, Manhattan has suffered flooding in the past.
Right, just recently as a matter of fact.
Just recently and in the 1980s, and it has caused billions of dollars in damage previously.
Right.
They considered building a series of dikes and water breaks in a similar fashion to the Thames River or the Netherlands to prevent such rushing in waters because they are fairly low to the waters. They decided not to. And so
anything that happens is on them.
pretty much they had the money, theoretically, they could have raised the money. Nobody wanted to pay out double of the insurance damage. Expensive, but would have theoretically prevented as much damage in coming floods.
Can you tell me what plastics have to do with global warming?
Not much, really. You have the theoretical production of plastics, which involves some energy, some CO2, and obviously digging oil out of the ground. But other than that, plastics are fairly inert. They don't react with much. They just stick around in the oceans and on our landfills.
Well, I think everybody can agree they don't need to be in the oceans.
Yes, nobody likes seeing a plastic bottle when they go to the beach.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what Al Gore Sr. did for a living?
He had 3 professions that I know of. The first one was he was elected to the Senate or Congress. I don't remember which one specifically. But every summer when Congress disbanded, he would go home to his farm, a tobacco farmer, along with some other crops. I do not know of what they were.
I was not aware that Senior and Junior had that in common.
Yeah.
And they live
In Tennessee,
okay.
I do not remember the name of the town, but it is in Tennessee. After Al Gore Sr. lost his election due to massive backlash of his no longer supporting the Vietnam War, he eventually became the head executive of a coal company in Tennessee.
Is that how the family made their wealth?
I do not know how the family made their wealth. I do know that some wealth was made. How much? Unknown. And
An unfortunate hypocrisy there.
yes.
What does population have to do with global warming?
Technically, nothing. A couple more billion humans breathing and living, it doesn't matter. The problem comes as a couple billion humans trying to feed themselves well, which requires, as far as we know, modern technology.
Does he explain how the population is connected to global warming, and does he give any solutions for it?
Not clearly, and basically told everybody in the Western world to stop consuming so much. That was his solution.
Like what specifically does he tell?
Not at that moment, no. His basic suggestions could be found at the end of the book.
What does he say not to consume?
Not to consume meat, engage less in car travel, invest in renewable resources and energy sources.
How does eating meat have anything to do with global warming?
Meat is a fairly energy intense crop, all things considered. It requires a lot amount of grain that could feed people. It requires water, a lot of water.
What kind of meat are we talking about? Because if we're talking about cattle should be eating grass.
True, but that requires a lot of area, so certain farmers have decided to go for high intensity cattle farming.
So if cattle were raised how they're supposed to be raised,
The food issue
people would naturally be eating less meat.
theoretically, but meat would also obviously raise in cost because of the difficulties of getting the grass raised and having the land for it. But you also still have the issue of water, which would mean that in certain areas like, say, Texas or California, those cattle industries would have to move to the East Coast, places where water is generally more abundant.
Maybe they should be.
Maybe they should be.
Maybe we should be a little bit smarter with our food crops, including animals.
Possibly, but this is a free country, so people will pretty much set up wherever the heck they feel like.
What did he mean by the way we treat forests as a political issue? Pages 222 and 223.
I'm honestly not quite sure what he means by that. I'm assuming he is talking about the way the redwoods were treated pre 1920s, 1950s, in which they were treated as a lumber resource. Great wood, nice and soft, kind of like pine, and obviously, who would want to cut down 5 pine trees when one redwood, those ginormous redwoods, would technically take care of most of those lumber causes as well? Just made more economic sense. It was safer to cut down one big tree than 5. So eventually it came to the part where people wanted the trees more than the lumber, and they had the money to actually care about that. They could find pine at cheaper costs thanks to other countries. Brazil being one of them, now producing very cheap lumber, trying to economically develop. And so, politically, people started forming groups, grassroots groups, to protect the forests. And eventually, the California government said, you know what, yes, this is something of a state treasure. We'll keep it intact and therefore prevented any more logging. Same with most of the other forests, like under Teddy Roosevelt, where he created the national parks, prevented hunting, fishing, logging, mining, and a bunch of other issues to preserve the natural state of the continent. So it was a political issue to one extent or another, usually because we had found another thing to offset it.
What does the Amazon have to do with global warming?
Well, theoretically, it consumes a large amount of CO2. Also, due to the clear cutting, it is slowly being decreased in capacity for holding on to CO2 and converting it into physical nutrition for trees and whatnot. And also, it's now being replaced with things like cattle farming, the big bad cows.
Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, to consider, probably not the greatest idea, but for the country with its population, it's not the worst. Because they do have the Amazon River. It still produces a fairly large amount of water. That hasn't seemed to have decreased very much. The trees aren't producing anything for them. It's not like it's an apple tree. So, not to mention they have just a bunch of orchids that don't tend to produce food, as far as I know. So they have some natural crops there.
Based on what you're saying, the high concentration of forests
Yes.
helps offset the CO2s. That would imply the more greenery we have in the world,
Yes.
the better it would offset CO2.
Yes.
Which would also imply that the cities, the great metropolises, are the worst global warming.
Centers, because they are mainly concrete spread out, and
Correct.
yes, that would also be correct.
So what could they do to offset their CO2?
They can put green roofs on their buildings, which I don't even...
I think Gore does mention that in the back.
He does mention that, or they can engage in the wonderful corruptness that is carbon offsetting, which is not the greatest idea and doesn't work, but it has been done, in which people spend money to lease out to protect a part of the forest that supposedly offsets their carbon emissions.
Interesting.
Which hasn't really made a difference, because most of these forests are already protected under federal land. They were never going to be cut to begin with, and so the offset never really happens.
What does Al Gore say or imply about the temperatures causing wildfires?
The higher the temperatures in the summer, the drier the leaves and the underbrush, and the more likely it is that a random errant spark of lightning that actually touches the ground is going to set something off.
And so if there are rangers in these areas being allowed to clean up the underbrush, then there wouldn't be any of these random...
It would definitely decrease the chances of a fire.
California, take note.
Yes, it would definitely decreases the chances of fire. Fires would still happen, obviously, but a tree is kind of hard to get started burning.
True. Okay, so On pages 240, 241, Gore mentions we have the power to divert the giant rivers according to our design instead of nature's. What is the issue with this?
Technically, it just means that, say for an instance, the Amazon River, you divert half of it into another part, the upper part of the country, for farming or whatnot. That other part has now lost its main river source and so starts to dry up. It converts from trees slowly dying due to lack of water because the tropics are used to that large river source going through to a more grassland area, and then eventually, theoretically, desert if it doesn't get enough rainwater. But it's the tropics, so I'm fairly certain that enough rain will get to those areas eventually.
I think basically this is just because we can
Yes.
doesn't mean we should.
Yes.
Okay.
Issues can come from diverting water, obviously, especially for natural situations.
Right.
But if it can benefit human lives, why would one not do it? Here's a question. If you were to lose the Everglades but could guarantee 1 billion human lives, which is more important?
Is it possible to have a zero emissions while living?
Possibly, but it is exceedingly difficult, expensive, and out of reach for all but the most wealthy, pretty much.
Well, the wealthy are traveling by private jets.
Precisely. We're talking about you. Well, it depends. It really depends on what you mean, because you could grow food the old-fashioned way, but you would spend most of your day on the farm. Heck, even with the machines, you would spend most of your day on the farm. You could try and suck carbon out of the air. So for the average person, no, there's no way to bring your emissions down to zero, just due to the fact that most of these green renewable technologies require coal or oil at some point in their existence. Those aforementioned wind turbines are made of fiberglass and balsa. Balsa grown in the Brazilian rainforest, which was cleared and then turned into balsa groves for this very purpose.
Can you tell us the pros and cons of the wind turbines?
The pros of the wind turbine is that you can theoretically set it up anywhere and it will slowly turn. Cons, it works about 10 to 40% of the time. I think 30% is the average. And there are certain places in the country that you cannot set up wind turbines. The one that I can name right off the top of my head is the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It was specifically set up in the least windy part of the country. Turbines are great when you just want something to occasionally work, and it saves you a little bit of effort. The most common example of this was out west. Farmers would drill for water, and they would just have a pump attached to a wind turbine that would pump it out of the ground. It turned every now and again. The plains are known for their wind, and so you just have those tiny little farm tower windmills pumping water out. Worked out just fine. But if you were to need more water, or you need more power, like electricity, it's not the greatest source because electricity needs to be made and used. You cannot store it effectively at this current time.
What happens to the turbine parts of it when they break?
Turbine parts are, as far as I know, non-reusable or refurbishable.
Doesn't this seem like we're shooting ourselves in the foot?
To some extent, yes. It is ironic that a green energy source would require fiberglass and oil to produce, a balsa wood farm in the Brazilian forest to be cut and transported up, manufacturing to produce it all, a 61-foot specialized steel trailer to transport the beams and other blades to the farms, all powered by a diesel semi-truck, of course, set up to operate for maybe 10 to 20 years, although I don't know how long the blades can last. They obviously suffer damage every time a bird hits it.
And not just small birds, but very large birds.
Very large birds of prey, which are endangered species, which would put me
which are federally protected.
Which are federally protected and would put me in prison if I shot one for killing my chickens.
Exactly.
But they kill hundreds.
But if we had a wind turbine, it would be totally fine.
Yeah, if we have.
Oh, that gives me an idea.
If you have 100 birds a year die, also it is calculated that thousands of butterflies, tens of thousands of butterflies get killed because they follow the wind currents, which put them directly in the path of a ginormous spitting blade. So it's starting to be questioned how much of the disappearance of the mariposa, not the mariposa, what's it called?
Monarch.
The monarch, yes. The monarch butterfly is due to pesticides, which haven't really seemed to have been a problem in recent years, or more due to the fact that they've been getting Cuisinarted by turbine blades, all to end their life being shipped back off to somewhere and buried in the ground.
Okay.
Oh, and you need to keep maintenance in it, which requires lubrication.
Oil.
Yes, so it's a very expensive form of energy, and it requires a certain amount of wind to operate.
Why do you think, or does Gore explain, why they politicize global warming?
They politicize global warming because they state that it is a crisis and that nobody can see the crisis, and so they need to get a politics into it because politics will get something done eventually. Much faster than it would by normal standards.
Uh-huh.
Precisely.
Okay. Do you have any final comments?
The book in its entirety seems like a constant play on emotions, and to ensure that you think that within the next year something's going to go wrong.
So he's creating a fear, a panic.
Yes. Also,
the sky is falling, we have to do something now.
Yes. Also, this doesn't really seem like a scientific book. A scientific book includes numbers, graphs, large amounts of graphs. Graphs with units that are comprehensible, not just squiggly lines on X and Y axes.
Okay, you did find a graph in there,
Yes.
But it wasn't the entire graph.
Yes, it was only the renewable sources, which showed how renewables have grown over the years, which they are the fastest growing energy market currently.
But it is only 10 to 20%?
10 to 13%,
okay.
Which is approximately equal to the amount of nuclear reactors we have in the country, and not even close to the 75% that they need to overtake with fossil fuels. Because that is what they intend to do, is because they want to get rid of most of this. Now, obviously, some things like transportation, it's kind of hard to get rid of because people like the range of them. I can't take the book seriously as a scientific piece. This book has no more say than the previous book, Global Warming by Chris Spence, I believe his name is, because unlike Chris Spence, which actually bothered to include a couple of graphs, it actually bothered to include a few references here and there. This book included none, was mainly derived from a slideshow of talks that he did, and I'm sorry, but I cannot take you seriously as a scientific commentator when you include pictures of crying babies and people who have drowned due to hurricanes in the streets. How? I cannot even put that on any form of social media or modern news network, but you managed to put this in this book, and this became required reading in certain states. How can I take you seriously? You're showing me pictures of dead bodies. This is the same kind of tactic that people did with Germany in World War I, with the attack of the Belgians. They showed pictures of German soldiers spearing civilians with their bayonets and children.
Wow.
That elicited emotion.
Right.
And obviously the British propaganda machine quickly picked up on that.
Right. So I think we can agree that this is not the best source to go to for information on how to better our world.
Not even close.
Okay.
Not even close.
So you would not recommend it?
I would not recommend it. It is not good for global warming. It is not good for any lifestyle change, really, especially if you want to offset your change for global warming, because in the end, you cannot live a proper life and offset your carbon emissions easily. Just thinking of, so just consider something like medieval life. Let's assume you have access to iron tools. Very nice. All those iron tools needed charcoal, which has a conversion rate of 1 pound of charcoal to 4 pounds of wood. And then so you had to burn a certain amount of charcoal to smelt the iron ore, to get the iron ore, to hammer it out and make it a nice, usable plow, scythe, or whatever. So all those iron tools had a carbon emission to it. Did your crop offset that? Maybe. But then again, you cut it down. It was turned into hay. You may have a couple of pigs, so you put that hay in there for them to eat and lay on or whatever. Or you used it for your cows. You consumed it yourself. You were breathing that entire time. That put out carbon into the air. You had to burn, theoretically, up to an acre of wood for cooking and warmth in your home, which became a fairly expensive commodity in later years. Or you just froze. You had to grow, potentially, linen crop, a flax crop for linen. Flax? I think it's flax. You had to spend time processing that lint, which was time that you spent, which needed to be provided by food. So even a medieval lifestyle in which you spend your entire day producing the things you need to live, you're already running low and probably never offsetting your carbon because you had to chop down an acre of trees just to keep warm and cook. Theoretically, just to produce clean water. Because clean water is a fairly rare thing in that time period. Even now, you can't just trust the tap. The tap is made to basically be, it won't kill you because you had a worm in it. That's basically all modern taps can guarantee, not it's healthy for you to drink. It's not. It's just meant to keep you alive and give you an access of running water, which is nice. Oh, the amount of energy you had to spend fetching water, because it's not like you had pipes in the Middle Ages. We don't live in China. We don't have bamboo here. We gotta get a bucket and drag it with us, and that's more energy, which needs to be offset by more food to provide that energy. Or otherwise you're going to turn into an emaciated skeleton, or you're just going to be really, really darn short because you're never going to grow past a certain age because you've dedicated most of your energy to muscle growth. And so, how do you offset your carbon? It's near impossible at a medieval level, and you can only really start to consider it at a modern level, and even then you need money to do so.
Well, that's why I thought he said on pages 277 and 278 that we can bring our individual carbon emissions to zero. I don't think that's possible this side of the dirt.
Yeah.
If you are a living person, you will have a carbon footprint. Even if you live off grid, you are still going to have a footprint.
Let's just consider an ironic situation here. Let's say you want to put a solar panel to cover your entire energy needs for the rest of your life, and you actually manage to calculate how much you would need to produce all the things you need for the rest of your life. You still need to produce that solar panel, which means you also have to include that in there as well. And this is where...
that's a carbon footprint.
Which, ironically enough, this becomes the rocket equation. The rocket equation is you want to put something in orbit, so you need more power. But to do that, you need more fuel, which requires more rocket, which means you need more power.
It's cyclical.
It's cyclical, and you never get anywhere. So there's an inherent limit to how much you can do. Because you can't just use sand. That's whenever somebody says, oh, you can use sand for solar panels. No, you can't. You need high-quality quartz, which needs to be mined. Then you need to smelt this with a fairly pure coal source to get the pure silicon you need. Then you need to machine that silicon and purify it even more, which is a process that I don't understand. And all along this way, you needed energy. So you need to completely offset all the energy with that using some sort of green energy, which of course you don't have. Because in the end, there's still coal and oil somewhere in the production process. Are wind turbines much better at producing wind than your tiny little farm spinner? Yes. But they also require more oil and more materials to build, all of which needs to be offset. So carbon zero is next to impossible for the entire production chain. Carbon zero lifestyle, the things I personally consume, once it comes into my domain and leaves my domain, yeah, I can offset that. Easy peasy. Can I offset the entire chain or my part of it? No. And that's just the unfortunate, one could almost call it an inconvenient truth.
Thank you very much for your review.
Yeah, don't recommend this book.